Thanks for coming out tonight for this special event. Many of you were probably here when Mr. Puleo gave his presentation on his very popular book, Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919, in this very room last year. Mr. Puleo is a gifted author, historian, teacher, and public speaker. All of his books have been Boston regional bestsellers and have received national recognition as well. Some people who have heard him speak, me included, say the experience is like attending a riveting lecture by a beloved professor.
I'll take that.
Mr. Puleo is a much sought-after dynamic speaker with 8 narrative history books to date, many of which you will have the opportunity to purchase here later tonight, I believe. And the library was excited to invite Mr. Puleo back for his newest book, The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the Fight for a More Perfect Union. Please join me in welcoming back Mr. Stephen Puleo.
Thanks for the intro. Hello, you guys. How are you?
Good.
Good. Were you any of you here for Dark Tide? Were you at that? Oh, good. Okay. Excellent.
I'm sorry, Dark Tide at WEHA, at Winthrop Historic Association.
Oh, yeah.
15?
Yeah, maybe
Something
15.
like that.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I was the president at the time.
Oh, I don't remember that, but yes.
There's a picture of us somewhere.
Oh, okay, great, excellent. No, it's been good, that book's been great. So this is my, just so you guys know, this is my 706th appearance as an author. I'm very excited, my second in Winthrop. So I've made 704 other appearances, but thrilled to be back in Winthrop. And I thought the Dark Tide one we did, I think it was the beginning of 2023, was terrific. So it was really good. This book's been exciting for me. The Great Abolitionist came out in April. It's done very well. I've gotten more emails on this book than any other book I've written from readers. Response has been excellent. So all that's been good. I've been really blessed with the way this book has turned out. And the responses come from people from all over the country. So Sumner, of course, Charles Sumner is from Massachusetts. He's the U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. During this incredible 2-decade period, the 1850s and the 1860s. He's elected first in 1851, and he's in the Senate till he dies in 1874. So he was definitely well known in Massachusetts, becomes a national figure very, very quickly. And it feels like the people who read the book know him, have heard of him, or if they haven't, are kind of astounded with all of his accomplishments and the big part that he played in American history. So when you look at Sumner, and people will say, well, why does Sumner even deserve a biography? And this is the first full biography on him in a little over 50 years. So David Donald, the Harvard historian, wrote part 1 of a biography in 1960 and part 2 in 1970. And there hasn't been much written on Sumner since that, and I felt like he needed to be resurrected. And so when you look at him, and you say, why does he deserve a biography? I've had people come to me, especially from the Boston area, who say, the only thing I know about Charles Sumner, the one thing I know is that the Sumner Tunnel is named after him, which of course it is not named after him. So I said to one reader, we said that, if that's the only thing you know, then you don't know anything about it. So read this book and you'll find out so much more. But I feel like Charles Sumner is, for the 2 decades that he's in Congress, he is the conscience of the North. He is the strongest, loudest, clearest, most controversial, most unwavering anti-slavery, equal rights voice in the entire country during this period. And think about this period, when you talk about the 1850s and the 1860s, we're talking about the run-up to the Civil War, the war itself, the assassination of a president, and the Reconstruction years that follow. Amazing years. And even saying it that way sometimes feels a little tame to me. But when you think about it, Sumner plays a role, is in the middle of, is in office during, however you want to say it, during things like the Fugitive Slave Act law, during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, during Bleeding Kansas, during the formation and the founding of the Republican Party, that anti-slavery Republican Party, during Bleeding Sumner, when he's beaten to within an inch of his life on the Senate floor by a South Carolina congressman with a cane. the Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right? John Brown's raid and execution, Lincoln's election, the secession of the South, Fort Sumter, the Emancipation Proclamation, Antietam, Gettysburg. Sumner is there during that whole time. All of the fighting in Virginia in 1864. You know, the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination in the spring of 1865. Sumner is there during the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, plays a really critical role in that. During the foundation, the passage and the ratification of the three great Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, that ends slavery in the United States, the 14th Amendment, that basically overturns the Dred Scott decision and says blacks can be citizens, and the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause brings those into the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment that gives black men the right to vote. Sumner has a role in all of those, a very strong role, and kind of the cherry on top for him is in 1870, when Sumner is highly instrumental in seating Hiram Revels to the United States Senate. Hiram Revels is the first African-American member of Congress. He is seated in 1870 in the United States Senate. He is from Mississippi, and he takes the seat, the former seat, of the former president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. So the first black member of Congress takes Jefferson Davis's seat. And Sumner is really an important part of that. My wife's signaling to me, get off of this loose board, because you can hear that. So I'll move right over here. I can see her doing this, like, oh, okay, feels better like that. Yes. So Sumner is a part of all of this, and I call this book, it's a biography, but I almost call it a biographical history, because you learn a great deal about the time period when you read this book, as well as Sumner's role in it. And he's so, I would say, powerful, influential during this period that I put him in this very small, select group of Americans, non-presidents, who are among the most important people in American history. So I put him right there with Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr., and Sumner. That's that, what I would call that small, influential group that helped change history and kind of make the United States where it is, what it is today. And Sumner does all of this with some real personal shortcomings, right? He has a lot of difficulty to get along with family and friends. His friends can only take him in small doses. He doesn't have any sense of humor. He's condescending. He's a little bit imperious. He's basically a know-it-all, definitely. He's one of these people that you don't really want to spend a lot of time with. He had very few close friends. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Fanny Longfellow are two of those who he's friends with, for a good part of his life, and a couple of others, but really has difficult times with relationships, and this costs him. In a profession that really requires alliances. Politics, right, requires alliances. Sumner takes a while to develop those, in part because of his positions, but also in part because of his personality. I think those two things go together. And after he's caned, after he's beaten in 1856, or while he's being beaten, almost no one goes to his aid right away, and that's another part of that personal issue that he has. He's not close to members of his family, and he's a twin. He's one of 9 siblings. He's a twin. He's not close to his twin sister Matilda. The only sibling he's really close to is his sister Mary, who dies in 1844. And it so happens that Sumner gets very sick during that same time period. They're in the same room, different beds in the same room, with their illness. And Sumner takes that Mary death really, really hard in 1844. But other than that, he has we'll talk a little bit about what that meant to him, but other than that, he doesn't have those kind of strong relationships. Even that inexplicable bond that twins have, he does not have with Matilda. So that is part and parcel of the Sumner personality. But he is unbuyable, he is unbribable. I never once saw him compromise on something he truly believed in for the sake of political expediency. He really, in the issue of slavery and equal rights, he is unparalleled. And so I think he is one of these figures that's so important in American history and so important to know in the positions that he takes and the speeches that he gives. He's a great orator. That's really his gift. But his ideas and the speeches that he gives are 100 years ahead of its time, ahead of their time. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And really, the ideas that he generates find their way throughout American history moving forward. So that's how important I think Sumner is. And he really begins this even before he's elected. So he's elected in 1851, okay? But in 1849, he really becomes nationally known, nationally famous, I would say, when he argues a case, an appeal, before the Massachusetts Supreme Court on behalf of 5-year-old Sarah Roberts. Sarah Roberts is a black girl whose father sues the Boston School Committee because Sarah is required to walk by 4 all white schools to get to her black school. And Sarah Roberts' dad just believes that's unjust, unequal, and sues. He loses at the lower level, loses to the school committee, loses to lower court, in lower court. And so Sumner is one of the lead lawyers, the lead lawyer, and makes the argument in the Supreme Court. It's a riveting argument. I would say one of the most important legal equal rights arguments in all of American history before the Supreme Court. For the first time in history, the words equal justice under the law are uttered in the United States of America, and they're uttered by Charles Sumner when he's arguing this case. For the first time in American history, the words separate but equal are inherently unequal are uttered in an American courtroom, and they're uttered by Charles Sumner in the Sarah Roberts case. So it's this brilliant argument. When I said he was 100 years plus ahead of his time, Sumner's arguments in the Sarah Roberts case find their way into the 14th Amendment in 1868, equal protection, equal justice, almost the exact language that Sumner uses in the argument. So they do find their way there. But they also find their way in 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education. Thurgood Marshall, who argues that case and argues that separate but equal is inherently unequal, uses almost identical language that Sumner had used in 1849, 105-year gap that Thurgood Marshall goes back and uses. And Sumner's words also find their way into a lot of Martin Luther King's arguments and speeches, into the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, and into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So Sumner really has that kind of a long-term influence. And some of the language that Sumner uses still gets kind of bandied about today. You know, equality under the law, equal justice under the law. Sumner is using that in 1849. That's incredibly early when you think about it, for him to be doing this. But he kind of develops a national reputation as a result of a Roberts case. And in 1851, he's elected to the Senate. And if you remember, there were no direct elections to the Senate then, right? The legislature elected the Senate. No direct voter elections to the Senate until 1913. And so Sumner is elected by the Massachusetts legislature in 1851 on the heels of a very controversial and contentious law that came out of the Compromise of 1850. And by the way, I'm going to talk about a few things tonight that you learned about in high school history and may have said, why do I need to know this? Right? Compromise of 1850 is one of those. Compromise of 1850 developed by Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. You remember them, the great senators, one from Massachusetts, one from Kentucky. Clay, the great compromiser. The Compromise of 1850 comes about, believe it or not, in this kind of serendipitous linkages that history often presents us with. Believe it or not, when gold is discovered in California. Gold is discovered in California. Thousands of people make their way west to the gold rush. California essentially skips the territory stage and applies for admittance to the United States as a state really quickly in 1849. There's only one problem. California is applying as a free state. And at the time, there were 30 states in the Union. 15 free, 15 slave. Very fragile balance that they've kept for years, Congress has, on that slavery issue. So the South kind of feels, and I think justifiably so, that not only will literally the balance of power be disrupted in the Senate when California gets 2 senators, so literally disrupted, but that slavery's momentum would really grind to a halt if California comes in as a free state. What will that mean for the rest of the territories when they eventually apply for admittance? Is this going to end the momentum of slavery? And I think the South probably has a good argument there in terms of the influence of California's efforts to come in as a free state. And so the South really demands something in return. And what they demand is the Compromise of 1850, the biggest component of which is a very stringent, tough fugitive slave law. Fugitive slave law says this, that when runaway slaves make their way to free states and slave hunters come looking for them, which they almost always did, particularly young men between the ages of 18 and 25, the most valuable pieces of slave property, slave hunters almost always came looking, that the northern states to which these slave hunters went were required to assist the slave hunters in their attempts to recapture the slaves and send them back to bondage. So that meant the legal apparatus, the police apparatus, all of it, the sheriffs were required under the Fugitive Slave Law to do this. Now Daniel Webster from Massachusetts takes a great deal of heat from abolitionists for this. He does it as a way to preserve the Union. Daniel Webster loved the Union and wanted it preserved, and sensed that things were coming apart a bit and thought this would help. So for the South, they really like this fugitive slave law. The North does not like it at all. They're furious with it. And it really comes to a head in 1851, April of 1851, when Boston sends its first fugitive slave back to bondage. Thomas Sims from Savannah, Georgia, escapes on a ship, on a brig, goes north. When the ship docks in Boston, he kind of hides in South Boston for a while. But after a fashion, he gets out a little bit and is finally captured downtown by a Georgia slave hunter. And the Massachusetts courts and police arrest him. He's in jail for about a week. He has a very cursory hearing that's required under the Fugitive Slave Law, and he is sent back to slavery. The morning he's sent back, it's 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. They take him out of the jail. There's a huge hollow square of police and troops. That's what they call it, hollow square. Sims is in the middle, and the hollow square of troops marches him down to the docks, surrounded by a couple of hundred abolitionists who are, screaming, shame, shame, shame on the way down. Boston is really taken aback by this, the cradle of liberty. Here we are in Boston, the cradle of liberty, and we're sending this slave back. It really hits home. Fugitive slave law becomes more than just words on a piece of paper. It becomes really real for the abolitionist community. The abolitionist community in Boston becomes much more militant right after this. Even Charles Sumner thought the abolitionist community up to this point was a little bit weak. They wrote editorials, they had little rallies, they gave speeches, but what else did they do? After the Sims case, they become much more militant, and they provide things like clothing and escape and the Underground Railroad and money and alibis for slaves that they help whisk either north to Canada or they hide even more deeply to escape. So a militant community in Boston, the abolitionist community grows, and that spreads around the North. The Boston abolitionist community is very influential in places like New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and so that really turns a little bit in terms of how the abolitionists deal with things. As far as the Massachusetts legislature, they're in the middle at this point in 1851. Daniel Webster is now in the cabinet. So now the legislature has to pick a new senator. And there's a very contentious battle, in the House particularly. And there are many candidates jockeying for position. Nobody really emerges. Some of the leading candidates fall by the wayside. lo and behold, just a few days after Thomas Sims is sent back to slavery, one candidate emerges as a dark horse candidate, and it's Charles Sumner. And he is elected on the 26th ballot by the Mass Legislature to the United States Senate in 1851, and almost as a direct result of the Thomas Sims case. So Sumner has been talking anti-slavery abolitionism in a radical way, and Sims gets sent back. There's that symbolism that the legislature kind of finds. And there's lots of moderates and conservatives, particularly in Boston, not so much the countryside, but in Boston, who are not big fans of Sumner. They're not abolitionists. They think abolitionists go too far. And so when he's elected, there are scowls on State Street, according to one businessman. They were not very, very happy with this. The abolitionist community is thrilled with it. And Sumner goes to the legislature with their mandate, at least, to do something on the issue of slavery. So think about that. Now, in Congress, he gets there in 1852, when Congress is in session. When Congress, to this point, 1852, had for the last, at least until the Missouri Compromise in 1820, but all the way back to when the Constitution was ratified, Congress had been trying to determine what to do with this slavery issue. How do we balance it? How do we manage it? The Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, they come up with this kind of strange compromise which says that every state below the very famous 3630 latitude would be a slave state. Every state above it, slavery would be prohibited, except in one state, Missouri, where it would be allowed. Awfully strange. And then they said, well, to balance things out, let's take a big part of Massachusetts and create a new free state, and we'll call that Maine. So Maine is part of the, when you go to a Gunquit and you get your T-shirt that says Maine, founded in 1820, that's part of the Missouri Compromise, when Maine is named a state to balance things off with Missouri. So since then, mainly people like Webster and John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay had been balancing this issue of slavery. Almost nobody wanted it abolished because they felt like that would tear the country apart. South certainly didn't want it abolished. They had a whole economic system built on it. But the North managed it and lived with it because A, they were benefiting economically from it, and B, they didn't want this country to break apart. And so Sumner gets down there, and in 1852 delivers the very first anti-slavery speech in congressional history. The very first anti-slavery speech in congressional history. Now, he's not even supposed to. They don't even want to talk about it because it's a presidential election year, 1852, and Congress was like, we don't want to really deal with this controversial issue. We want that to the side, off to the side. We'll deal with other stuff. And Sumner insists and finally gets the floor in 1852. And he delivers, I think, one of the most important speeches in American history, certainly one of his most important speeches in 1852, called Freedom National, Slavery Sectional, or shortened often to the Freedom National speech. And in this speech, Sumner argues that the founding and the underpinnings of the United States are freedom and equality. And that is the national ideology underpinning of the United States. That the founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, talk about these principles, liberty, equality, and deliberately omit specific mentions of slavery. That they skirt the issue, yes, the Constitution skirts it in a couple of different places without mentioning it. Sumner's argument is, and I think a good argument, that the founders and the framers needed to make these compromises in order for the United States to get off the ground, in order for this country that hoped to become a more perfect union to even begin. That without these compromises at that point, there would have been almost no support from the South Carolinians, no support from the North Carolinians, probably most important, no support from the Virginians. And so things would never have gotten off the ground. Sumner's contention was that the founders thought slavery would die out over 20 years or so, and that's why there's language in the Constitution that said there would be no prohibition against the transatlantic slave trade until 1808. And then after that, Congress could do that. The feeling was that slavery would die out. That doesn't happen after something totally unrelated occurs. The cotton gin is invented by Eli Whitney and gives us big cotton, gives us king cotton in the South over the next 30 or 35 years. But Sumner's argument was that the Constitution itself gave Congress no power to make a king, nor did it give it power to make a slave. That slavery could not be surmised, inferred, supposed, conjectured, that if the founders and framers had wanted slavery to be part of the nation's founding, it would have been affirmatively declared in the Constitution. Okay, very important point. He's making this in 1852. Turns the South's argument on its head. The South had argued up to that point, and it kind of, in bars and in coffee shops and, occasionally on the floor, the South's argument always was, Congress has no right to prohibit slavery anywhere because there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits slavery. Sumner turns it on its head. He takes this very conservative argument of this conservative means, which is support of the Constitution, to try to achieve a very radical end then, which is the end of slavery, or abolishing the fugitive slave law in this case. And so Sumner says, no, you should not toss out the Constitution, or you should not look at the Constitution and say that slavery should be allowed because it's not specifically prohibited. You should look at the founding fathers and look at the arguments and look at the language itself and say that slavery should be prohibited because the concepts of freedom and equality obliterate the very notion of slavery. So that's kind of the argument he makes, an amazing argument in 1852. So he turns the South's argument on its head, but he also turns the abolitionist argument on its head. There are many abolitionists at this point, some of the more radical abolitionists, that said, we should tear up the Declaration, we should tear up the Constitution, we need to start again with no slavery. And so and that made the abolitionist movement, that radical abolitionist movement, it was off-putting to a lot of moderates and a lot of conservatives who viewed it in some ways an anti-American movement, right? So what Sumner says is, no, it's the quintessential American movement. The country is based on equality and based on freedom. And slavery is the very antithesis of that. And so he makes this argument, if you love America, you must hate slavery. That's one of his direct quotes in this speech. If you love America, you must hate slavery. So he kind of turns that abolitionist argument on its head and makes the concept of abolitionism more mainstream and more American, if you will. And if all of this is true, Sumner says, certainly Congress has no right for people in a slave state to reach into free states to bring slaves back, to bring slaves back. So Sumner says, in that case, I move right now in 1852, to abolish the fugitive slave law. That's what he does at the end of this Freedom National speech. Now he loses in the Senate 47-4. The vote goes down in flames, 47-4. Sumner, I think, expected to lose, didn't expect to lose that big. It's a real come down for him. His ego is bruised. He has a big ego, and his ego is bruised. However, he has made an impact on the northern lawmakers, the southern lawmakers, on residents of each section. Southern lawmakers, many of them comment, Sumner is the new anti-slavery force in the United States. Sumner is the new force. It's not William Lloyd Garrison, right? It's not some of these other abolitionists at the time in 1852. It's not, you know, Lydia Marie Child who's around, or Harriet Beecher Stowe who's around. And eventually, it wouldn't even be Abraham Lincoln. But it's Charles Sumner who's the force. And some people, even in the South, said, well, I'm paraphrasing here, and I don't think we can buy this guy off either. Yeah, we gotta keep our eyes on this guy. He could be a real problem. In the North, here's this Charles Sumner abolitionist who was on the fringes, a little bit of a radical, but boy, some of those arguments he makes are pretty strong and pretty powerful and pretty compelling. You know, he is going to influence people in the North. And he continues to do it in 1853 and in 1854, and things come to a head again with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. What is the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Give me a quick summary. I'm kidding, I'm joking, no.
I could have handled the other two, this one.
So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right, is another one of these things that you learned about in high school. So Kansas and Nebraska, two territories who are about to apply for statehood in 1853 and into the early part of 1854. Nebraska probably a little too far north for slavery to be economically viable. Kansas, the perfect place. Couldn't grow cotton there, but you could grow rice there, you could grow hemp there, other crops, things like that. So Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat, senator from Illinois, has this brilliant idea. Brilliant idea to him, maybe not to many others. That instead of following the Missouri Compromise, which would make Kansas and Nebraska free states when they came in, because they're north of the 36-38 parallel, how about we blow up the Missouri Compromise, toss it out after 34 years, and we allow the residents of each of those territories and then states to determine how they want to come into the Union. I'm going to call this notion popular sovereignty. Do you guys remember that term, popular sovereignty? Let them vote on whether slavery should be allowed. Now, the South loves this idea because they figure they can take all of these pro-slavery people from Missouri, you know, border state, to Kansas, have them go over to Kansas and vote, send people from the South to vote. That should be great. Great idea, they say, to Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat. The North is outraged by this, completely outraged. What are you doing? Why are you blowing up the Missouri Compromise? And Douglas completely miscalculates the reaction in the North. They are outraged. There are big, massive protests all across the North against Douglas. You know, people burn him in effigy. In fact, Stephen Douglas, by the way, a very self-aware guy, says after that he feels like he could find his way home from Washington, D.C. to his home in Chicago at night by the light of his own burning effigies. Very, very self-aware. It's a very self-aware statement. Why would Douglas do this? Why does he want to obliterate the Missouri Compromise? I will let you in on a surprise. He wants to do it for political reasons. Political reasons. Two reasons. Stephen Douglas he's very ambitious. He's called the Little Giant because he's small in stature, but he's got big ambitions and big expectations. He wants to be president. And he believes he's going to need Southern Democrat, Reed, slaveholder support to be president. By the way, he's right about that. Could not get elected without it. So that's one. Two, there's talk about a transcontinental railroad in the United States, which does not happen for about a dozen years. However, there's a lot of talk in 1854 about one. And the South wants the eastern terminus, the so-called eastern terminus of that transcontinental railroad, to be in the slave state of Missouri. That is St. Louis. Douglas wants the eastern terminus to be in the northern state, his home state of Illinois, that is Chicago. And so he does some horse trading with the South. He jockeys for position in the South and rams through, much to Sumner's chagrin, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There is mayhem in Kansas because not only is the South sent thousands of people to Kansas, Northern abolitionists from Boston, from Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, Indiana, others send thousands of people to Kansas. There is violence in Kansas. That's the phrase, bleeding Kansas. There's murder, there's rape, there's mayhem, there's property destruction. During all of 1855 and into 1866, the center of the slavery debate in the United States is not Massachusetts and not like a South Carolina, but the geographical center of the country, which is Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, that phrase that you'll see when you read this book or any book of the era, that's what that refers to. Sumner gets hundreds of letters from Kansans who say, please, sir, help us. What are you going to do about this? You're the anti-slavery voice now. You need to help us. Sumner does what he does best. He decides he needs to give another major speech on the floor of Congress. And he does. May 19th and May 20th, 1856, he delivers a 5-hour speech, 3 hours on the first day, 2 hours on the second day, called The Crime Against Kansas. And again, it's a brilliant speech. He talks about the evils of slavery, he talks about the Kansas mayhem and all of the violence in Kansas and how it needs to be stopped, and how slavery in and of itself breeds violence. And so he gives this great speech. Had he done that and had he stopped there, probably things would have been okay. But Sumner had this habit, and it's part of his personality, of really using personal invective and personal insults in speeches, because he always felt, very deliberately he did, he always felt that that was a better way to get someone's attention, and then you could deal with them on policy and on issues. And so Charles Sumner, in this case, uses as his target Senator Andrew Butler from South Carolina, maybe one of the most pro-slavery senators in Congress from one of the most pro-slavery states in Congress. Now, Andrew Butler is not in the chamber during the Crime Against Kansas speech. He is home because he is recovering from a stroke, and the stroke left his face partially paralyzed. He had a very difficult time speaking. I mean, he would spit when he spoke, and had a tough time with it. So Sumner insults him personally in a couple of ways. One, he says that, you know, he expectorates, Butler expectorates every time he talks. And that leads to Sumner's little play on words, and every time he opens his mouth, out flies a blunder. Okay? And he also says, Andrew Butler has a mistress who is polluted in the eyes of the rest of us, but chaste in his eyes. I am talking about the harlot slavery. So he brings up this prostitute kind of mindset. The South goes wild. I can't believe anybody is doing this kind of personal insult on the floor of the Senate. By the way, the Senate floor was packed at that time. Everybody wants to hear Sumner. The New York Times reported that even the ladies' gallery was filled to overflowing, which almost never happened. So there's murmuring and kind of yelling in the Senate chamber, and Stephen Douglas, who's in the back of the room, says that damn fool is going to get himself killed by another damn fool. So there's howling in the Senate chamber on both sides, but the South is particularly outraged. And more outraged than anyone is South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks, who was in the chamber for day one, not in the chamber from day two, but read the speech. Preston Brooks is not only from South Carolina, but he is Andrew Butler's second cousin. So this is a family affair. This is a family insult. Debates over the next day and a half what he's going to do to Sumner. Shall I challenge him to a duel? He says to his colleagues. No, his colleagues said, duels are only reserved for gentlemen. Sumner does not rise to the level of a gentleman. Well, how about I ask him to step outside? We settle it like men. No, someone will probably tell you, you come to my desk if you have something to say. Which, by the way, that is probably true about Sumner. So Brooks finally makes a decision. And on the morning of May 22nd, 1856, Preston Brooks and two of his colleagues come over from the other side, the House side, to the Senate. Now they're out of session. There was a funeral earlier. Both the House and the Senate are out of session. One of their members' funeral, for one of their members' funerals. So there were a few people milling about in the Senate chamber. And Charles Sumner happens to be at the front of the room at his desk, It's one of these desks that is manacled to the floor. His chair is on wheels. And Sumner's a big guy, he's like 6'4", he's got big legs, and he's kind of wedged under that chair. And he is signing copies of his Crime Against Kansas speech that had been pre-printed for him to mail to newspapers, to constituents around the country. That's what he's doing. Oblivious to, there's some milling around in the chamber, oblivious to what's going on. Brooks and his two colleagues come in. Brooks has a cane. He used a cane because he was wounded in a duel himself in the 1840s. So not unusual that he should have a cane. Walked in, they sat down. Why did you sit down? They asked Brooks later. Because there was a lady in the chamber talking to the sergeant at arms, and I felt it would be unchivalrous to do what I came to do when a lady was in the chamber. So she leaves in about 15 minutes or so, and Brooks stands up, walks down the center aisle. Keep in mind, Sumner's head's down, oblivious, signing copies, franking copies of his speech. Brooks gets to the front, says, "Mr. Sumner." Sumner starts to look up as Brooks raises his cane. And Brooks says, "I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel to my state and my kin." And bang, brings the cane down on the top of Sumner's head. Sumner's head explodes in blood. And at that point, Preston Brooks loses it. The bloodlust, I think, really takes over, and he begins beating Sumner again and again. Sumner's trying to get out from under the desk. He can't do it. He finally literally wrenches the desk from its manacles and tips over a bit. Brooks doesn't let him tip over, grabs him by the lapel, and beats him again and again and again. Later he said, "I gave him 30 first-rate stripes." At the end, he was bellowing like a calf, and every one of those licks went exactly where I intended. He literally shatters his cane as part of the beating. A couple people move forward to help Brooks's colleagues, say, "No, let them be. Let them go at it." And nobody moves forward. And Sumner is beaten in a pool of his own blood, and just before he loses consciousness says, "I can't believe such a thing can happen." Brooks walks out. Sumner's colleagues come over and help him. They treat him. They send him back to his lodgings. The caning, news of the caning ripples across the country like a brush fire, right? Sumner is out of the Senate for a total of 3 years during this period. Tries to go back a couple times. He's got brain damage, brain trauma, neck trauma, scalp, fractured skull or close to a fractured skull, spinal injuries, and PTSD, what we would call PTSD today. Every time he tried to get close to Washington, his headaches got worse. So he goes to Europe even for a couple of years. The news of the caning, as I said, ripples across the country. There's 3,000 newspapers in the United States at the time, north and south, and anyone who can read reads one. News the next day. We already had the Telegraph, keep in mind. The next day, the caning news is on the front page of almost every paper in the country. Two very distinct editorial approaches. In the South, Preston Brooks is lauded and celebrated, and in the North, he is just criticized beyond belief that something like this could happen. And the reaction to residents is the exact opposite. In the South, Brooks is celebrated. Many Southerners send him gifts of canes, some of them inscribed with the words, "Hit him again," as part of that. These abolitionists have gone too far. They're trying to ruin our way of life. Sumner is the epitome of what they're trying to do. We finally had to bring him down a peg. In the North, complete outrage, right? Complete outrage. Even more moderate and conservatives who didn't have strong opinions on slavery, thought Sumner sometimes went over the top a little bit with his language and his positions. Those people were left with almost nowhere to go but in the Sumner Republican camp. As a matter of fact, over the summer and fall of 1856, the beating was in May, over the summer and fall of 1856, thousands and thousands of people join this fledgling Republican Party, this anti-slavery party. McCain is almost used as a symbol, not almost, is used as a symbol to increase membership. Matter of fact, during that summer, Sumner was trying to get back to work, and he couldn't. The pain was too much, couldn't get back to work. And most of the letters he received from his colleagues said things like, you know what, don't rush, don't hurry, make sure you're well, because your vacant chair speaks more effectively than you can. What a great symbol this vacant chair is. The Republican Party membership grows so much during the summer and fall of 1856 that they put up their first candidate for president in November, John C. Fremont, and he almost wins. He loses to James Buchanan, but only because he lost a few northern states. The South sees that a united North, like a candidate who could win every northern state, could get elected president without a single Southern electoral vote, which is, by the way, what happens in 1860 with Abraham Lincoln, right? That's exactly what happened. The harbinger of that is 1856. That's what they see after the king. Sumner is trying to get well. He can't do it. He goes to Europe twice. Undergoes this excruciating, painful cure that a French surgeon thought could help, which was an open flame on Sumner's bare back as a way to alleviate some of the pressure on his spine. Sumner was burned, as he called it, 8 times, 6, 7, 8 times, I think, in total in 1858. You know, suppurations and boils on his back, he said. I could barely stand many times. I certainly couldn't sleep on my back for weeks afterwards. It was awful. It was awful. But this was his effort to try to get well and try to get back in the game. He doesn't get back to the States until 1859, right around John Brown's execution, late 1859. 1860 makes his way to Congress, and in June of 1860 delivers what would become the last anti-slavery speech in American history, called The Barbarism of Slavery, in which he takes slavery apart point by point in total. Never mind slavery in new territories, never mind slavery in the States, but slavery in total. He takes it apart in 1860. And that's the last speech. So he is the first in 1852, the last in 1860, is caned to within an inch of his life in the middle in 1856. But after his speech in 1860, when he has lost none of his fire, some Southerners even said maybe we should beat him again because he hadn't lost any of his fire. After that, there is no speech, so anti-slavery speech. There's none during the summer. Lincoln is elected in the fall. The South starts to secede in summer of 1860, and of course, in early 61, some of the other southern states go out, and after Fort Sumter, you know, the 4 most northern states go out, including Virginia. So Sumner does all of that in the midst of this pain, and again continues to be the voice and the conscience of the North, so much so that his relationship with Abraham Lincoln, and I just want to touch on that, which is in the book. In fact, the book starts with the prologue of Charles Sumner at Lincoln's bedside the night Lincoln is shot in 1865, where Sumner stayed the whole night, held vigil. Several people did. Sumner was one of them. Sumner said when Lincoln was finally declared dead at 7:20 a.m. on April 15th of 1865, Sumner said, "I sobbed like a woman." They were very close. The 2 men were very close. They had a very short relationship. They don't meet until late February of 1861, when Lincoln comes east after he wins. So he comes east for the inauguration in March. And of course, Lincoln dies in 1865. So it's this 4-year relationship, but it's a very, very important relationship. When they first get there, I would say the 2 men learn from each other, right? Sumner teaches Lincoln the importance of standing tall, standing in a courageous way, standing for principle, despite the politics of the situation. right? Sumner is very influential, for example, in getting Lincoln to end slavery in Washington, D.C., the territory, in April of 1862. Very influential in getting Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. So very, very influential in that. He's relentless, I would say, in his efforts to do that. On the other side of the ledger, Lincoln teaches Sumner some things, right? Lincoln teaches Sumner the importance of using humor sometimes to diffuse a situation, or to kind of move or lubricate the situation, move it along, right? My favorite example of that is very early when they first meet. So it's February 24th, I think, in Washington, D.C. February 24th, 1861. It's the day after Lincoln gets to Washington. And he's in the hotel and he's about to receive Sumner. You know, Sumner comes in and Lincoln notices, wow, this guy's tall. He's like 6'4", he's like as tall as me. So Lincoln says to Sumner, how about we stand back to back to see who's taller? Sumner is completely flummoxed by this, doesn't know what to do with it. It's a joke, doesn't know how to handle it. And he says, mumbles, Mr. President-elect, maybe we should present a united front against the slave power instead of uniting our backs. You know, and kind of walks away. And Lincoln, you know, Lincoln's quote was, I've never met a bishop in my life, but that guy reminds me of what a bishop would be. Very imperious, very kind of condescending, doesn't have this great sense of humor. But after a fashion, Sumner softens a little bit because of Lincoln's influence in that area. Softens a little bit. Abraham Lincoln also teaches Sumner a little bit about politics. And sometimes you do have to take politics into consideration. Case in point, as Sumner is constantly in Lincoln's ear about the Emancipation Proclamation, particularly during 1862, Lincoln says to him, listen, we are basically getting hammered by the Confederates. We need a victory of some sort for me to then issue an Emancipation Proclamation. You know, we're getting beaten at every turn. It makes no sense for me to do this now. He gets that little opening, and it's a little opening, on September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day in American history at Antietam. Battle of Antietam. The North ekes out a victory. It's basically a draw, but I would say the North ekes out a victory. Lincoln uses that. It's one of the reasons Antietam is so important, in addition to the carnage and the battle itself. Lincoln uses that to issue the Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later to say it would take effect January 1, 1863. Sumner, think about the Emancipation Proclamation. It frees only those slaves that are in rebellion against the United States. That is, the Confederates who have seceded. There are 4 northern border states in which slavery is alive and well. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. They're all part of the Union, and they all have slavery. Sumner is outraged by this, and he says to Lincoln, why aren't you including the border states in the North in the Emancipation Proclamation? It only makes sense. Lincoln says to Sumner, listen, I hope to have God on my side in this struggle, but I must have Kentucky. I must have Kentucky. Kentucky has population, Kentucky has farmland, Kentucky has factories, Kentucky is the protectorate of Illinois and Indiana. Lincoln says to Sumner, if we lose Kentucky, we are going to lose Maryland. If we lose Maryland, guess what? Geographically, we're going to lose D.C. We're going to lose the federal capital. These border states will secede because slavery is still existing there and still a big part of it. So Sumner kind of gets that. Sumner kind of gets that. But Lincoln has to walk him through the politics of it. And I think the other thing Lincoln teaches Sumner is the importance of personal connections. Personal connections, the things Sumner wasn't good at. City Point, Virginia, 1865. Sumner and Lincoln are there together at Grant's headquarters. There's also a very large Union hospital there. And Sumner comments that he watched Abraham Lincoln shake the hands of 5,000 wounded Union soldiers and know exactly what to say to each man who was very serious, many of them seriously wounded, amputations, you know, the wounds of the Civil War, which I'm sure you guys know, were horrific. And Sumner said he knew just how long to stay at each bedside before moving on. He knew exactly what to say to each person before moving on. He knew how to be inspiring without being patronizing before moving on. So Sumner learned a lot about that and tries to do a little better than that after, you know, after Lincoln's assassination, during the, as I said, the 13th, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. You know, he never becomes a touchy-feely guy. He does not. But he gets better at it as a result of the Lincoln connection. So I think those two really taught each other something, and that Lincoln-Sumner relationship is a big part of the book. I'll finish with this and then, of course, get to your questions. I think Charles Sumner, what do we say about him? What is his legacy? You know, the Compromise of 1877 that prematurely ended Reconstruction delays his legacy for 100 years. You know, not his anti-slavery legacy, which gets taken care of very quickly, but his equal rights legacy. But I will say this. Charles Sumner believed in the United States of America. He believed in its founding. He believed in its founding documents. He believed in it as it split apart. He believed in it after he was caned. He believed in it after a president had been assassinated. He believed in it during the very difficult time of Reconstruction. The power of his ideas came from this deep-seated belief in the country. And so I think we owe him a lot. We owe him for his relentlessness, for his perseverance, for his influence, long-term influence. We owe him for his vision that a country that he believed in so deeply was worth fighting for so hard. And I think that he does do that. So let me get a drink of water and then I'll get some questions from you guys. Thank you so much. And if you guys ask questions, feel free to ask anything. Like, you can ask about the book, history, writing process. I get a lot of writing process questions. You know, publishing, agents, whatever. So don't be shy. We don't have a big crowd, but feel free.
Oh, thank you very much. That was fabulous.
Thank you. And what's your first name?
Tracy.
Tracy. Is there an E between the C and the Y?
Yeah.
Okay. Just get, yeah. Doesn't mean anything. I'm just double checking. Yes. Okay.
I love that. It was entertaining. It was inspiring. I was not a big history person growing up, but I've become one because my husband's such a history buff.
Right.
And so he's turned me on to history. I've read a number of your books, enjoyed all of them.
Thank you, Tracy.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful that you've come to Winthrop, and I apologize for that we don't have a larger crowd. I think we didn't get the word out very well.
Okay.
I think other people would have, I know so many people I could think of that would have loved your talk. And
Well, you know
so
what,
I
Tracy?
appreciate that.
Pass the word about the
Absolutely.
book, about me. Look at my website, see where I'm speaking, have them come.
I certainly will.
But thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah.
I do have a question about
Please.
how do you, when you do your research, I don't know anything about researching a novel, but where do you get all your information?
Yeah. So when you, by the way, I'm not saying when you buy the book, if you buy it, great, but when you see the bibliographic essay in the back, it's like a 30-page bibliographic essay. Please read it from beginning to end. And it will tell you how I use all these sources. But in this case, I would say the major pieces of this is Sumner was a prolific writer. He wrote, if there was a day he didn't write, even during his recovery, like there's times during his recovery period after the beating where he says, I only could write 3 letters today, you know? If there was a day he didn't write, I don't know if I found it. So he's a prolific writer. And because of his influence, he gets hundreds of letters written back to him from people from all over the country. So that's a huge source, a huge primary source. I use primary sources on all of my books. I just think you have to do that when you write. I write narrative history, so I think when you read the book, you'll see that it moves pretty fast. But you always have to have like a solid foundation of primary sources, which I use. So yes, the letters form the basis of it. Sumner wrote his own, what he called his works, which he started collecting very early in his career. And it's about a 15-volume set that he includes his speeches. He includes clips from newspapers after his speeches, letters from people who say, I loved your speech and here's why. So, you know, you can put together this tapestry of Sumner's life. And of course, around that, you know, there's Lincoln papers, there's Stephen Douglas papers, there's a lot of these are available both in libraries and digitally. Some of these papers, there's many Lincoln papers available digitally. Most of Sumner's papers are at the Boston Public Library on old-fashioned microfilm still. But yes, there's a really great 2-volume annotated collection of Sumner's letters by Beverly Palmer. I think she did it around 1988, somewhere like that, that were really helpful to me as source material. So that's kind of the background of that.
Do you travel to different libraries all around the country?
Yeah, so I will say I travel to archives and libraries, you know, when I need to. We just went on a southern road trip and I had to stop at the University of Alabama at Birmingham for the still secret Book 9 research. And you know, I've been to the archives, I've done a lot of research at the National Archives and things like that, but sometimes when it's available digitally, you can use it digitally, like it's great. You know, one of the things about the technology, I have a lot of people who ask me, do you use the internet to do research? And I say yes, you would be silly not to, you just have to be careful of the source, right? But the Mass Historical Society, for example, has every letter between John Adams and Abigail Adams, in the regular written form and transcript, you know, so that you can read it easily. Of course you would use that. Why wouldn't you use that, right? So there's National Archives, Library of Congress, all have many digital collections. So when people ask me that question, I'll say, sure, use that. Those are fine sources. But then there are times that those things don't exist, and you do have to go to archives. And yeah, I've dealt with 100 archivists, you know, librarians, you know. But for primary sources, it's mostly archivists, because that's where the letter collections are and things like that. Some libraries hold those. Boston Public Library holds some of those. But for the most part, libraries don't hold what I would call primary sources, you know. Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah,
The actual canes
yeah.
that he was beaten with, is that at the old State House?
Well, so that is one of the folklore myths. Yes, that is a replica cane. But the actual cane is shattered, you know, into many, many pieces, and many Southern congressmen picked up those pieces and wore them around their necks in solidarity with Brooks. So Brooks is basically left with just a gold knob of the cane when he's done with the beating. Yeah.
And why wasn't he charged with?
Well, he was charged, so I'm glad you asked the question. I can't say everything in the presentation, so questions are a good time to do that. So Brooks is charged, he's charged with assault, and his sentence is a fine of $500, which his colleagues pay. There's also a move in the House to expel Brooks, and it requires a 2/3 vote to expel. They do not get the 2/3, they get a majority vote. Brooks, very prideful guy, is not happy that there's even a majority vote to expel, so he resigns his seat in July of 1856, stands for re-election in the special election for his seat in August, and wins by a claim. And then in the November election, which is the regular election, wins unanimously his seat back, and then dies suddenly in January of 1857 from a throat infection. There is a massive funeral in the South. His body is taken, 26 men from Edgefield, which is the western part of South Carolina, Edgefield County, about 30 minutes from Augusta, Georgia. A party of 26 men come to DC after his body had lain in state there, and take his body back to South Carolina, to Edgefield. And along the way, thousands of people salute Preston Brooks. In fact, that's part of the North's agita, you know, like if there had been some condemnation of Brooks, maybe the North could have said, oh, it's this one hot-headed, but here's the whole South just out celebrating Brooks. So they kind of realized, things have definitely changed, like probably irrevocably changed. I tell people that Preston Brooks, from May of 1856 when he beat Sumner to January of 1857 when he dies and has their funeral. So 8 months, 9 months, whatever that is, 8 months. Is as big in the South as John C. Calhoun was before him and as Robert E. Lee was after him. Now, he doesn't have the staying power of either of those two, but in the moment, in the historical moment, he's just as big.
One more question.
Yeah, sure.
Does he have descendants? Did he have children?
Sumner did not have children. He had a disastrous marriage in 1866. That is a little bit of the juicy part of the biography, you know, if you're going to read. He has a real trouble with women, and he marries somebody half his age, very late in his life. He's 58. He's 56. She's 28. And it doesn't work out. So he does not have children. The only nephews and nieces he had was his sister Julia, who I believe had 3 children. But he loses several siblings. Like he loses 2 siblings at sea in ship accident, you know, ships capsized at sea. He loses Mary through fever that he sees in 1844, which kind of makes him realize he needs to do something else with his life. So some of his siblings die in very violent ways. You know, it's kind of a cursed family in a way, I think, when you look at it. Yeah.
Do you think he's given his fair, I don't know what you call it,
Due.
in the state, Sumner, is he considered a hero of the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I don't. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I think he does deserve that in a sense. But at least let me see what's out there. That's kind of was my approach going into the book. And I got a taste of that. I wrote a book called The Caning that came out in 2012. You get a taste of Sumner's accomplishments. So no, I don't. And if you look at the timeline, you know, there's 2 big statues of Sumner in the Boston area. One is in the public garden, him standing on a pedestal, got his jacket behind him, sort of, and it just says Sumner on the pedestal. And one is in Harvard Square, right near Harvard Yard, right across the street. And he's seated. He's a Harvard Law School alumnus, and he's seated there, and it just says Sumner. Both of these were erected in the late 19th century because you didn't really need to say anything else but Sumner, because he was so well known. And then I think some of his cachet and some of his accomplishments kind of disappeared. There were a few biographies written about him in the early 20th century, 1910, 1915. Then nothing until David Donald in 1960, you know. So, yeah.
Was it because of what he did after the Civil War? Or
No, I think after the Civil War, you know, he's very much involved in Andrew Johnson's impeachment, but I think that's a fairly popular point of view, particularly in Massachusetts at that point. And then his 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, I think, are very important. Now, where I think some of his reputation does take a little bit of a dive is he battles with Ulysses S. Grant over the island of Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. Grant wants to acquire it. Sumner is totally opposed to that. He ends up in this kind of match with Grant, and things get so bad that he doesn't support Grant in 1872 when Grant runs for re-election. Sumner supports Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor, and the Republican Party at that point all but banishes Sumner in 1872. Now, Sumner dies in 1874, and they sort of re-embrace him in his death for all of his accomplishments. So I think he has a little blip there, but I don't think it's that either. I just think, and I get this question a lot, I just think that the Boston Civil War, as influential as Boston was in the Civil War, I think a lot of its Civil War history has been kind of lost. You know, there's pieces here and there that emerge, like the Mass 54th monument across the street from the State House that's very well visited. But for the most part, and it's nothing up here like it is in the South. You know, Kate and I spent a lot of time in the South, gone to all the battlefields, many of the battlefields, you know. And I think part of the reason is the war itself, right, as far north as it gets, is the angle at Gettysburg. That's the high watermark for the Confederacy. It doesn't get any higher than southern Pennsylvania. I think that influences a little bit how the North perceives of it in general. So I think I think some of Sumner's accomplishments get lost because of that.
You were talking about how much information you can find online now, which you can find online.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's rather amazing, actually, and that's only in the last 10 years.
I'd say that's right, 10 years, I'd say 10, I was thinking 2010, 2012, so yeah, I'd say that.
Do you
You're
think that'll
exactly right.
change how, not people write books, but the way people find out about people like Charles Sumner? Is there
Yeah, I
there's a
think,
marketing opportunity in some ways, is there?
well, I mean, there's the marketing piece, I think that's a separate piece, right? Like, you're online on social media, I can do a lot of things quickly in terms of the marketing piece. But yeah, I think it changes some of the research too. I mean, I like sometimes going to archives, and I like touching the documents from 150 years ago. There's something about it that's special. But, I mean, listen, if you can save a 50-mile drive to the archives and still get the same letter, yeah, I think it's gonna change.
Or the other way around, I mean, is there a better opportunity to get information out about Charles Sumner online than by selling books? I mean, you wanna sell books, but either,
The answer is yes, I wanna sell books. That is a true statement. That is the truest statement you've made tonight. Yes, what else?
but what do you want, is it useful to have, I don't know, can you make money off the internet selling, having a Charles Sumner site sort of?
CharlesSutter.com.
Well, not, I don't know.
Well, all right, let me try the answer this way. So there was a time, and I think it was around the time you're saying, 2012, where this whole notion of the book as an object, people in the publishing community, agents, everybody else was like, it's going away. Everything's gonna be, at the time, a Nook, or, I forget the Kindle, thank you. A Nook, Kindle, everything's gonna be Nook and Kindle. Everything's gonna be on a tablet. That changes around 2016 or 17. All of a sudden, books come roaring back. Like, all the experts were wrong. Now, I'm not saying people don't use Kindles, and they do. But I'm saying, the book as an object came right back. It was a very quick, like I said, even within the community, it was this very quick turnaround. So people, I think, are gonna keep buying books. They'll buy them via Amazon. They'll buy them online. I mean, a lot of independent bookstores have struggled, but I would say even since about 2020, independent bookstores are making a little resurgence. I think that's true too.
But you want people to know about Charles Sumner, and how many people will buy the book, I mean, compared to the number of citizens in this town. Be able to, maybe there's some online way that, I don't know, how would it ever possibly work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's,
Get
like,
people smarter.
for me, it's just like, I'll do the best I can to get the word out. Blogs, blogs are a great opportunity. I do an e-newsletter that comes out about 4 or 5 times a year that tells you everything you need to know about Puleo in general, but Sumner will be part of that. You can sign up here, by the way, just a little marketing thing. If you just leave me your name and email. And I only do 4 or 5 a year, so you're not gonna get spammed every day and, nothing like that. But I'll do my next one in December, so you'll get one in early December, that'll be it for the year, so. But yeah, so I mean, I can do that, those kinds of things.
Well, not so much you, but as a
Yeah.
industry, it'd be better, no, as a country, if we all knew, if more people were here because they knew about the guy, knew he's from Massachusetts.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and said, well, I don't know that much about
the
him, but I know a little
marketing,
bit.
I would say the marketing piece, so people sometimes ask me like, hey, this is your 8th book. Have you found it easier? So I will say, no, it's not easier. It's different. It's that I know I can finish a book now, which you don't know at book 1, right? But you do know now, so I kind of have a process. But the writing is just as hard, the research is just as hard, the writing is just as hard, and the marketing is just as hard.
Sure.
And maybe harder because it's so diffused, right? You've had a lot of newspapers collapsing, a lot of newspapers that used to be, oh, well, I'll go to the Globe, I'll go to the Herald. Book sections in newspapers have been reduced down to this. So it's more diffused now. You have to do things, be a little bit more creative online, and so I try to do that. And I will say this, and this is no reflection to this small group tonight. I've been very blessed with the size of my crowds. I've been so blessed. Like, I have a lot of loyal readers, and the crowds have been very good, at my presentation. So, I take a lot of heart in that, a lot of encouragement in that. So, yeah, I
It's
mean,
more a problem getting the word out in our town
Well,
right now.
Maybe so.
in the library's defense about getting the word out.
yeah.
Did a great job doing that. We, social media we rely on that a lot, and
Sure.
Winthrop Nice Discussion Groups reaches 16,000 people. Why we didn't get a lot more from here, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I just
You don't
wonder-
have to apologize for
No,
that
I wanna-
anymore. Okay, that's the
there was a
last
comment-
apology
a
from,
comment made,
yes, I
You
understand.
know, and so I
Yes.
just wonder, there were efforts.
Yeah, I
A
totally
lot of
believe that, of
efforts,
course,
yeah.
yes, Mary Lou and I have been,
Okay.
yeah, she's been right on top of
She's good
things.
at what she does.
She's great at what she
Yeah.
does, oh, yeah, no, I hope that didn't come across from me,
No.
absolutely not, yeah, okay, yeah.
I'm curious, okay, of the 8 books that you've written, and I haven't read The Caning, and I
Yeah,
haven't read your new one yet, but,
yeah, I'm glad, because I haven't written it yet.
Oh.
no, I mean.
Oh, you mean The Great Abolitionist?
Yeah.
Yes, no, I'm joking, go
Your
ahead. yeah.
newest one
Yes.
that's already been published. But I'm curious about, you wrote The Caning about that event.
That event, yeah.
And then, in your mind, did you like, okay, like, I finished the book, but I'm not finished with Sumner yet.
Yes,
Is that-
exactly, and
And
that,
he
matter
was
of
on the
fact,
back burner while you were writing
yes,
these other books?
I wrote 2 books in between. I wrote
Okay.
American Treasures and Voyage of Mercy in between, but I couldn't get rid of Sumner
Okay,
in my head.
I was trying to figure out.
Yes, that's what happened.
Visiting,
Yes.
okay.
It happens a lot with me, I have many things going on in my head at once. But that, yes, Sumner was in my, I just knew I had to do more, you know. I do think the caning, the subtitle of the caning is The Assault That Drove America to Civil War. I do think the caning is the incident that takes the whole slavery debate from a political, academic, religious debate to this emotional, gut-wrenching moment. And it still takes 5 years for the war to start, from May of '56 to April of '61, right? It still takes 5 years, but the dominoes really start to topple after the caning. That's the irrevocable moment, I think. So is the caning the cause of the Civil War? No. Slavery is the ultimate cause of the Civil War. But the caning is the incident that I think is the catalyst that makes war unavoidable. That's what I said. Irrevocable, unavoidable. So that's the caning. And the whole Sumner relationship with Lincoln and post-Lincoln, that story hadn't been told, you know? Like, so I just felt like that Sumner during the war, because the caning ends basically with the attack on Fort Sumter. That's how the caning ends, the beginning of the Civil War. So I said, I gotta do more on Sumner and his contributions during the war, during Reconstruction, and then during the research, found much of the Sarah Roberts stuff when he makes this separate but equal argument, and he makes this equal protection under the law argument. So I felt like, man, this guy needs more. So that's where it came from. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
yeah.
I'm just,
If there's more, ask, like, I'm fine.
no,
I'm literally an open book, so, you know, feel free to ask
no, I
anything
had
like that.
another kind of like offbeat question, but
Yeah,
I think it was, you mentioned that there's a couple of statues
yeah,
in the Boston area
of Sumner,
honoring Sumner.
yeah,
And they just say Sumner.
yeah.
If they said Charles Sumner, people wouldn't confuse, well, people might not confuse it with the
Well-
person that the tunnel's named after.
Well, I think, what I'm saying is, I think when I'm using that phraseology, they don't say Charles Sumner, you know, from 1851 to 1874, leading the legislature. There's none of that, because that wasn't needed. That's what I'm trying to say, yeah.
But one of the, I think, I read some reviews of your book.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
one is Kirkus, we use Kirkus in the
Yeah,
library.
great review, thank you,
And, yeah,
Curtis,
great.
yeah.
Great resource for me. And I think in that review, it mentions the statue in the public garden. And it said it just uses his surname.
Correct,
So I haven't gone to see it,
yeah,
but it just says apparently Sumner.
that is exactly what it
So
says.
I think people visiting the public garden see that, they're like, oh, that's who the Sumner Tunnel's named after.
Oh, sure, I think something like that is probably true. And I mean, I feel like it's a natural thing when you go through the Sumner Tunnel to think it's,
Were they
Yeah.
related?
no, he's a general from War of 1812 from East Boston, no relation. Yeah, so,
Yeah,
but I do
think
have
that
these,
would bother you, I don't know, if people would assume.
I mean, it doesn't really bother me, I think it's kind of, like, that is a true story when this person said to me, listen, I know nothing about Sumner except the Sumner Tunnel is named after him. I'm like, well, So, yeah,
Well, I was trying to talk this event up to a couple of people.
Yeah.
And said, oh, oh, the guy they named the Sumner Tunnel after. I
Yeah.
said, no.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's, yeah, I mean, it feels natural that someone would think that, you know? But, yeah.
Where's he buried?
He's buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And if you go, I've been there, if you go to his grave, it's this little kind
Did
of.
you say Sumner on it, or?
No, it's the Sumner grave site, so his parents are there, most of his siblings, I don't think all of his siblings are there, the two people that lost us at sea were not. But it's a very, I would say, it doesn't look like you're visiting a famous person's grave, maybe that's a way to say it.
It's not the fanciest.
It's not fancy, there's a lot of fancy stuff
From Mount Auburn.
in Mount Auburn, right? But it's on this little tree-lined path, and you'll see it's there, you'll find it, you could find it at the, I forget what they call the cemetery ledger, but I'll call it the cemetery ledger. You can find it, but yeah, that's where he is, Mount Auburn, Cambridge. He grew up on the backside of Beacon Hill, if you're ever in the Beacon Hill area, there's a plaque on his house.
So the actual house?
The actual Sumner homestead, yeah, which obviously is privately owned by others now. But he actually sells that house later in his life because for one reason he needs the money. So that location of that house is very close to the black section of Beacon Hill. So Sarah Roberts, the Roberts family does not live far from Sumner. As he's, I'll say growing up, but as he's developing into a lawyer, and yeah. So. All right, guys?
Great.
Okay,
Great,
yeah,
thank you.
obviously, email me, call me, talk to me,